This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the fourth session. I'm afraid Scott is the master of it all, albeit it's an hour ahead. Carl Wright, in the previous session, talked about the dichotomy between democracy and development in the aims of the Commonwealth, which, of course, is a relationship. Many people have used many words over, much ink has been spilled over. Nevertheless, it is clearly true that for the majority of member states of the Commonwealth, development is a key aim in itself, if not the key aim. As the former Secretary General John McKinnon once said, you can't eat democracy. It's also the case that at the beginning of the 21st century, there are still hundreds of millions of our fellow Commonwealth citizens living in dire poverty, without access to basic healthcare, basic education, and so on. Many Commonwealth countries will be meeting the Millennium Development Goals that were agreed by the United Nations in 2000, but many won't, and some of them will fail to meet them by a very long margin. So, of course, the question arises how those countries can be helped to reach those goals, if not in 2015. Let's not forget that that's only 2 and a bit years away. If not by 2015, then certainly as soon as possible thereafter. To address that question, and in particular to address the question of how the Commonwealth itself, as an association, as a set of institutions, and as a network, can help those countries to meet that aim, we have 2 speakers today, both of whom are extremely well qualified to talk on this topic. Our first speaker today will be Sir Malcolm Bruce, who has been MP for Gordon since 1983. But in fact, unlike many of the younger politicians in the House of Commons, particularly on the front benches of the government and the opposition, he has what Roy Jenkins would have called the hinterland. Before joining the House of Commons, he had a very successful career in journalism, publishing, and business. And in the 30 years or so, almost 30 years that he's been in the House of Commons, he's been his party, the Liberal Party, and then the Liberal Democrat Party spokesman on a whole range of issues, and has indeed been a member of, I should think, probably half a dozen select committees. But most importantly, and the reason why he is here to talk to us today, since 2005, he has been chair of the House of Commons Select Committee on International Development. So I think before I introduce Myles, I think perhaps we should allow Sir Malcolm to take the question, looking at what the Commonwealth can do in relation to development post-2015.
Well, thank you very much. I'm not sure I can give you the answers, which is why I thought we'd use space for questions at the end. If we start with the Millennium Development Goal, if not literally, then for all intents and purposes, the MDGs were dreamed up within the United Nations and delivered to the world from the misty heights of the New York skyscraper. They weren't written in tablets of stone, and there were only 8 of them. But in a sense, what is surprising is the extent to which even partially they've been adopted and pursued, to a greater extent perhaps than many people expected, and indeed the first 2 years would have anticipated. Certainly donor countries, NGOs, charities, and quite a number of developing countries have monitored their progress on development against their performance according to the MDGs. So in the UK, the Department for International Development a few years ago adopted in its annual reports a traffic light system to show how development partnership countries were performing against the MDGs. So green on track, amber off track but possibly able to achieve, and obviously red off track. At the time, of course, they simply published these and didn't make any causal link between those traffic lights and the contribution of the Overseas Development Department's policy towards achieving or changing them. There are plenty of critiques of the MDGs flying around, so I don't think you need another one from me. All I would say is that in some, although it took some time for the goals to catch on, they had the advantage, a really important advantage, of being quantifiable and measurable, or at least some of them did. Of course, saying we're going to halve the number of people in poverty also means you're effectively abandoning half the people to poverty. It also encourages going after the easier hits. So to put it crudely, it's easier to raise a poor person who's living on 90 cents to $1 than one who's living on 50 cents to $1. So that's where you'll tend to go first. But even so, heading for those goals and achieving or partly achieving them does represent progress. Yesterday, World Bank President Jim Yong Kim and Bono launched a dialogue under the title, What Will It Take? What will it take to explore ideas to end absolute poverty? In other words, truly to make poverty history. But of course that could be a crude target. It does mean a direct transfer of funds to the poorest countries of the world, but it also means determined redistribution within middle-income countries, where increasingly the majority of the world's poorest people live. Next year, the United Kingdom is committed to delivering 0.7% of our gross national income to official development assistance, the first G20 country to do so. I'm proud of that, and I hope, I have to say it is hope more than expectation, that it will set an example to others. Although I can say in parentheses, last week I had a conversation with a number of politicians and administrators in the French development network, and they were of the view that France still had that aspiration, but didn't set a target or a date, but they were hoping that they could push them in that direction. And I would say that even so, we achieved the 0.7%, that's very worthwhile, but the world is changing. And what poor people in poor countries really want is not aid. What they want, I would argue, is the capacity to trade, to secure livelihoods, and through that to bring up healthy, educated children, develop a tax base to deliver public services and social security. And what poor people in middle-income countries need are governments committed to ensure that the resources of their countries are fairly shared to reduce inequality and extremes of wealth and poverty. It's not just an issue, of course, in middle-income countries, it is also an issue in rich countries. But that cannot be imposed from outside. It has to be a collective commitment all governments sign up to and on which the people themselves are consulting. The developed world is facing the worst crisis in living memory. Its impact may not be so dreadful as the 1930s, as the world is 3 times richer, although I doubt the people of Greece or Spain will share that view. And no government can feel confident of where our economies and public finances will be in 5 or 10 years' time. Almost certainly, in my opinion, the developed world will be relatively poorer and the developing world relatively richer in the coming decades. If poor people are to aspire to standards of living anywhere close to what the developed world enjoys even today, it will have to be achieved by a different route from the one that we took. Consuming the world's resources at the same rate as we have done so far to achieve the economy of today would require, it is said, 3 planets. And I have to tell you folks, we've only one. And not even Mars can come to the rescue. So that is why the successors to the MDGs must incorporate Sustainable Development Goals as well. Sustainability comes in 2 forms. Firstly, there is the finite nature of physical resources, and secondly, there's the impact of human activity on the global climate. My constituency is in the northeast of Scotland, in and around Aberdeen. The advantage that we have is that we are the shore base for North Sea oil and gas development, and increasingly the centre of technical expertise tested in the North Sea and exported around the world. Unemployment in my Gordon constituency stands today at 1%, the lowest in the United Kingdom, indeed probably lower than almost anywhere else in the world. However, we know that although we will almost certainly still be extracting fossil fuels from the United Kingdom continental shelf in 30 years' time, it will be at a lower rate. And more to the point, it takes hundreds of millions of years for minerals to develop to geological usefulness. Humankind has only been around for a few minutes, and we do not operate on a time span that allows for replenishment. Yes, I know that if you look at a graph of forward depletion, it consistently shows the world's resources running out within 25 years. That has been the case for the last 100 years. But eventually, we will run into the buffers. And critically, if the world develops at the same pace as hitherto, to meet the needs of up to 9 billion people. We cannot deny poor people in the world access to these resources or their added value, not least because many of them are within their sovereign territory. So we need a shared undertaking to optimise resources, share them to mutual benefit, and to build in recycling and reusability to the design of everything we do with these irreplaceable assets. It seems to me that actually could present poor people in these regions with invaluable livelihood opportunities, and also give their governments a tax base to sustain services. Climate change threatens to engulf us in an environmental disaster that will change life on the planet irretrievably. We need to move to zero carbon growth as fast as humanly possible, but in ways that give space for poor people to be raised out of their poverty. Not surprisingly, developed countries are not impressed by arguments that the planet is so vulnerable that they cannot expect to develop in the same unsustainable way that the developed countries have. Or to put it another way, rich nations have climbed to a platform of elevated wealth and, having inflicted untold damage in the process, pulled up the ladder behind them. So we need to build sustainability into the fabric of the post-2015 development agenda. The focus at the moment is on the work of the high-level panel appointed by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon. The co-chairs, as we know, are President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono of Indonesia, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf of Liberia, and Prime Minister David Cameron of the United Kingdom. They're due to deliver their report by the end of May next year, which will go into a process that will continue to deliver the detail towards the end of 2014. This time, everyone wants a piece of the action. The advantage of the previous process, the one I described at the beginning, is it was quick and dirty. This one has the character of a global committee, and the danger in that is it will produce a global camel. Although, to be fair to camels, they may not be pretty, they smell and they bite, but they do have qualities of endurance and survivability in extreme circumstances. The committee I had the honour to chair, the International Development Committee of the House of Commons, is currently conducting an inquiry into the post-2015 development goals. We've had the benefit of evidence from the impressive Amina Mohammed, the Special Advisor for the Secretary-General on Post-Development Planning, as well as an informal, down-to-earth exchange with panel member from India, Abhijit Banerjee. And two things have already emerged. They're unsurprising. The first is that whatever is agreed at the end must be clear, memorable, and quantifiable. The second is that it must have the widest possible ownership. It will not be comprehensive in detail. If it were, it will be too long and complicated to be memorable. There will be omissions, and people will complain about that. But nevertheless, in my view, the focus on the needs of women and children cannot be blunted. Health and education are a given, but this time, maybe more attention should be given to capacity building, including building a fair and inclusive tax base. President Kim of the World Bank and our own Prime Minister have both suggested that an overriding commitment must be the elimination of absolute poverty by an agreed date, that 2030, 2040, But that has to mean something. The World Bank rankings of countries by per capita income identifies the poorest countries. And clearly those countries which are so poor are a priority. And lifting those countries out of poverty must be a global priority. However, the bulk of the poorest people now live in middle-income countries. So this makes the distinction between lower middle-income countries and upper middle-income countries more relevant. Most of us would agree that countries with per capita incomes under $4,000 are poor and probably need outside help if they're to eliminate absolute poverty. And I'll return to this when I look at the UK government and Commonwealth priorities. But simple per capita income, however, is a blunt instrument. For many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, growth rates in recent years have been impressive, but much of that has been down to mineral exploitation. Unless that wealth is shared in terms of livelihoods for citizens and an expansion of the state budget, then the capacity to have a real impact on poverty is muted. There's clear debate about who is the beneficiary of the exploitation of those minerals, how much of it, if any, gets into the national treasuries, how much of it is taken out by foreign investors, and how much of it reaches the people in terms of improving their quality of life. Improvements in poverty reduction in South Asia have usually been accompanied by a green revolution, which has the double effect of improving food security and access, lack of which is a basic contributor to poverty, and improving the cash incomes of the rural and poor. All this makes clear that if we are to achieve quantifiable, absolute and sustainable improvements in living standards and the elimination, we need a truly global compact. Governments of all countries need to sign up and need to engage their people in a united effort to achieve results. Before he became Prime Minister, David Cameron identified what he described as a golden thread of governance-related issues, which he said were essential to underpin successful development. These are absence of war, presence of good governance, property rights, rule of law, effective public services, strong civil institutions, free and fair trade and open markets. For most of us, these are admirable components of successful societies, although it has to be acknowledged that economies such as China and Vietnam have made great strides towards eliminating poverty without all these elements present. I'm hoping I'm going to have an opportunity in the not too distant future to ask Mr. Cameron to explain further how this golden thread could be taken into the post-2015 process. I also want to test his personal commitment beyond the high-level panel. If we're to achieve a set of goals to succeed the MDGs, we need champions among heads of government and ex-heads of government to maintain momentum once they're adopted. Simply to take part in a process that delivers results and then move on to something else is not going to be good enough. Whatever happens at the end of this process, as I've said already, the development agenda is changing. There remains a moral obligation for the richer nations to transfer resources to the poorest. And I'll point out in a minute one or two changes the UK could make in this context. But increasingly, what will change is the need to pursue policies across the board towards creating a more equitable and sustainable world. Emerging economies are understandably flexing their newfound muscle. Developed economies are struggling with a sclerotic overhang of debt, which severely limits their room for negotiation. Inertia and vested interests will work together to frustrate progress, which is why identifying foundation issues which underpin any new commitments is essential. If nothing else, the golden thread is a useful place to start. But meanwhile, what should we be doing? It goes without saying we should continue striving towards the currently agreed goals. They were, after all, for 2015, and there's still a couple of years to go. We should not let up pursuing those. Let me be a little parochial first about the UK, and then try and relate that to the Commonwealth. When the coalition government was formed, Andrew Mitchell, as Secretary of State, instituted 2 reviews of bilateral and multilateral aid, the BAR and the MAR. He also set up a review of humanitarian and emergency response, the HER. As a result, the number of countries where the UK has a bilateral programme was reduced from 43 to 28. The MAR judged multilateral partners on the terms with which they matched the DFID agenda. So some which were marked down were not necessarily being judged on their own terms. I think the Commonwealth Secretariat falls in that category, and not surprisingly they weren't very happy with it. But I think it's important to recognise DFID was simply saying how fit are those for our purposes, not how fit are they for our own defined purposes. I'm not sure in all those reviews we've got the outcome quite right. I think it's surprising that we have a programme in South Africa, by any standards, a middle-income country. Now, DFID is more of a regional function, but we have bilateral offices in Mozambique, Malawi, Zambia and Zimbabwe. I really don't see a case for South Africa. Especially, as much more surprisingly, the programme in Burundi was closed, even though the DFID commitment to all the neighbouring countries was increased, yet Burundi is poorer and more vulnerable than its neighbours. Part of the argument was that the budget was too small to be efficiently managed. I would argue that the answer to that would be to increase the budget. The office in Gambia was closed some years ago, even though that country remains a low-income country by any standards. So these kind of things suggest to me that DFID, and I could quote other examples, on occasions is too big to deal with small but real problems. And that I think is unfortunate. Yet last week, having looked at the abandonment of these small countries, the Secretary of State announced the start of a rundown of the aid programme in India on the grounds that India needed technical advice rather than aid. To be fair, she also said that it was agreed in consultation and full partnership with Indian government ministers, and that's absolutely as it should be. So that might be the right decision, although I'd like to explore the detail further. Currently, the India programme is 280 million, mostly going to the poorest states, some of which are larger than all but the largest sub-Saharan African states. The Secretary of State has indicated that after 2015, the official development assistance to India, mostly going through technical support and advice, will be around 30 million a year. So that is obviously a radical change. Yet by contrast, neighbouring Pakistan, which is also classed as a middle-income country, albeit lower down the scale, will be the biggest single recipient of UK bilateral aid. And Nigeria, with per capita income almost the same as India, will continue to retain a large UK programme. Of course, these partnerships are mutual. They require the agreement of both governments, and different governments will take their own view. But I detect some lack of coherence in the different approach, I have to say, at the moment. Increasingly, I believe the relationships will change away from a direct transfer of funds to building capacity through training and infrastructure. Logically, that should be done in partnership with multilateral agencies, maybe more joint programming, including regional development banks and cooperation among bilateral donors. What does sub-Saharan Africa, for example, need? It needs improved transport links, road, rail, air and sea, to promote inter-regional trade. It needs reliable, affordable and sustainable power. It needs skills and professional training to build the capacity and integrity of public and private sectors. So I suggest that means post-2015 should see a sharper focus on secondary and tertiary education and mixed financing of infrastructure projects, increasingly delivered by local people. As an aside, what I find quite astonishing when engaging in discussions bilaterally with many of the poorest developing countries is that we concentrate on registering primary school numbers, whilst forgetting that without secondary and tertiary education, you cannot produce competent civil servants, administrators or business people, and you can't ultimately build a successful state. I was indeed in a conversation with the education minister in Ghana when one of my committees said, you should get your team to investigate certain aspects of education. And the minister said, have you enjoyed your cup of tea? To which my colleague said, yes, why do you ask? He said, that was my department who served you the tea. That, I hope, has improved in Ghana, but nevertheless, that's sometimes the scale of the challenge. And certainly in South Sudan, I was told by ministers that more than half of the civil servants recruited into the South Sudan government were actually illiterate, and none of them knew how to operate a computer, even if they had one. So these are the sort of challenges we have to confront. So The reviews the British government have carried out have been instructive, in my view, not least in exposing the need for a much more radical think about the future of development cooperation, which the International Development Committee is committed to exploring. But it does actually take the debate into new territory, and that's why we're conducting a longer-term inquiry into the future of international development cooperation. So what about the Commonwealth? The Commonwealth is a unique organisation which brings together large and small and rich and poor states. It has the capacity to inform the debate, distill the views of countries which are too small to get the attention they need and deserve, and to help shape the balance and compromise needed to secure real agreement in development priorities. Sadly, the Commonwealth contains around half the world's poorest people and a high proportion of people suffering from off-track MDGs. So useful analysis on the scale of the challenges and policy recommendations on the best ways to overcome them could have real influence on all the major donors. Maybe the Commonwealth could set up its own small, high-level panel and task force to present an authoritative agenda to the United Nations and help shape the post-2015 settlement in ways that meet the identified and agreed needs of Commonwealth citizens. The development agenda is on the cusp of radical change. The greatest danger is that faced with long drawn-out economic paralysis, the richer nations will use the excuse that poverty has reduced and emerging economies are taking control of their own destiny to scale down their commitments, which have already been downgraded by many. If we are to end absolute poverty and deliver sustainable development across the globe, the Commonwealth needs to be a player. The best way to achieve this is to deliver authoritative evidence and provide leadership based on consensus achieved across a representative cross-section of developed and developing states. It would be pretentious of me in the extreme to second-guess the high-level panel or anticipate the likely outcome of the process. In any case, we should not preempt or eliminate the diversity or spontaneity of the inputs which will be distilled into the final outcome. I'm a great believer in asking poor people why they're poor and what it would take for their circumstances to improve. Apart from the extreme effects of conflict and displacement, for most it's a lack of gainful employment. I spent a night in the village in rural Burundi last year, and when people said to me what was the experience like, I said, you might be shocked by this, but what came across to me more than anything else was the crushing boredom of living in that environment. There was nothing to do, and there was no daylight for half the 24 hours. So whenever I talk to families who are on an upward curve out of poverty, the priorities for any income they receive is to pay for health and education. Indeed, one mother complained to me that when the government of Malawi introduced free education for all, the quality of the education provided fell sharply to the disadvantage of those who had previously been paying. So the quality of services matter at least as much as their provision. Making poverty history is a great slogan, but what does it mean? Abolishing absolute poverty would be an achievement, but only if it equips people with the means to build a better life in the long term. The success of the post-2015 outcome will depend on its clarity and simplicity. Commitment to making it happen will depend on the breadth of its ownership. It may start with a high-level panel, but to work, it must finish with universal support. So no pressure.
Well, I'd like to thank Myles very much for that. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions and responses. But first, I'd like to introduce Myles Wickstead, who, again, is extremely well qualified to speak on this topic. He's actually another graduate of St Andrews. I don't know if Daisy you've got a hidden agenda here, but Myles was mentioned with what is now Wickstead, goes back many, many years to the point when it was the Ministry of Overseas Development. And he stayed with it when it went in and out of the Foreign Office. He ended his diplomatic career, but not his career, as ambassador to Ethiopia. He was then the secretary or head of the Secretariat of the Commission for Africa. And since 2005, he's been Professor of International Relations at the Open University and has spoken and published widely on development issues. Myles is going to give us a response to Sir Malcolm's talk, and then we'll open the floor to questions.
Thanks very much, Alex. Well, I'm only going to speak for about 5 minutes, so we've got plenty of time for questions and answers. And one of the other things I now do is I'm a special advisor to the International Development Select Committee, so you wouldn't be surprised if I don't disagree with anything that Malcolm has said. I thought it might just be worth spending just a couple of minutes teasing out this critical path over the next 2 or 3 years and seeing how the Commonwealth might be able to feed into that. And Malcolm's already told us a great deal about the high-level panel, this panel that's due to be reporting in the middle of next year, and that will be setting the framework for what comes after these Millennium Development Goals in 2015. But there's also another important process, and Malcolm touched on this as well, which is around sustainable development goals and sustainability, and that's all come out of the Rio Plus 20 process last summer. And there is an intergovernmental panel which is being established to look at these sustainable development goals, which is around issues like climate change and pollution and environment, etc. So what's really important is that these things come together, and this is really a task for the UN Secretary General, because both of these processes will report into the UN Secretary General. And at some time around the end of 2014, I hope that those processes will indeed coalesce and can be brought into a single process. And then I think the aspiration must be to kind of be looking post-2015 at development which has 3 pillars, essentially. One is around the kind of aspirations of the Millennium Development Goals, if you like, and a great deal of that depends on economic growth, and that's been largely responsible for driving the progress against these 8 targets that Mark has already mentioned. Then the second issue is around equity, and Mark also mentioned this, about making things fairer, about not just reaching the people who it's easier to reach, but reaching the really hard to reach, difficult groups. And for people who listened to the news this morning, all the news this morning was about child poverty in the UK. And what does child poverty in the UK mean? It's about reaching those hard-to-reach groups, and you can't mention how poor they are just by the level of income of their families or their parents. It's about access to education, how they're treated, if their parents have drug abuse, etc., etc. And then this third pillar must be around sustainability and, are we growing economically and making people better off, but at the expense of really destroying the planet? Because if we do that, then there's no point in any grid, because it's not going to be sustainable. The 3 pillars that really need to be brought together in that process. Malcolm's completely right to say that the MDGs are kind of rather partial, and they were sort of cooked up in a basement rather than the top of a New York skyscraper, but there we are. They are partial. If you go back, however, to the Millennium Declaration, then that gives you all the stuff you need around education, and around health, and around equity, and around rules of law, and around environment, etc. So I think there's a really strong motivation for going back to the Millennium Declaration and using that as the basis for what goes into the future. So that's the kind of critical path that I see over the next 2 or 3 years. And I suppose the question for people in this room and others is how can the Commonwealth help to support that process? Not I don't think, and Mark made this point too, it's kind of how you feed into the process. It's not by setting up separate processes, but how you can reinforce those processes that are already happening. And one of the very encouraging things about this kind of post-2015 settlement is that a very strong consultation process has been set up already. And it's possible, I think, for the Commonwealth to feed into that. And indeed, I know that's already happening. The Commonwealth Foundation already has its Breaking Point programme, which is designed precisely to feed in, along with the UN Millennium campaign, to feed into that consultation process. Lots of potential, I would say, in the education group, the ministerial working group. I mean, I've just, someone said the communique from August, the Mauritius communique, specifically noting that a Commonwealth ministerial working group was to be set up to feed into the post-MDGs and post-education for all goals. Those recommendations should be published sometime around now. I have no idea how far that process has got, but maybe that's a little bit of a test case of how well the Commonwealth is doing and whether it's in crisis or not. You know, is that report more or less ready now? What would it say? And one thing I hope it will say, and it would be a very good example of how the Commonwealth can support this process, again, is a point that Mark made, that it's no good just focusing on primary education. You've got to focus more on secondary education and tertiary education, and capacity building, and how you develop lawyers and soil scientists and all those skills as well. And I think that's something we ought to ask GFID a bit more about as well, by the way, in the select committee process. So, is there anything more specific maybe we could say on this critical part? It is interesting, isn't it, that Australia is going to be the G20 presidency in 2014, and actually the G20 matters more than the G8 does these days. I mean, it would be surprising if the G8 didn't have stuff to say around this in the middle of next year, when we host the first summit that we're going to have since Glen Eagles in the middle of next year. I'm very confident, particularly with the Prime Minister's membership of this high-level panel, that development will be on there and will try to push this process ahead. But with Australia hosting the G20 in 2014, maybe Australia is in a very strong position to take some of the results of some of these consultations, processes that the Commonwealth has in place, in a position therefore to feed some of that thinking into the G20. So there's an opportunity there. And, the question you're asking is about, is the Commonwealth in crisis, is reform possible? I think it's all about, and I came in just at the end of the previous session, and it did seem to me that people were saying the Commonwealth is in a position to help and respond and be positive in the future as long as it can find the right niche. And I think this is all about a question of finding the right niche. Thank you.
Well, I think there's plenty of material there for questions. What I'd like to ask people, really two things. One is, please could you give your name when you're about to ask a question. You may well think that everyone knows you. In fact, everyone might well know you, but it's quite useful for the audio record. The second is, could you please raise your voice when you're asking a question, because there is a problem with the people at the back of the hall not being able to hear questions from the front. So if I can have this lady.
Poverty is created by oppression, post-independence, movement for justice and peace in Sri Lanka, post-independence, internal colonialism of the last 64 years have made the Tamils much poorer. They are now under the army of occupation and starving. The army is taking up all the jobs, running shops, growing vegetables, selling everything. So the poor people are unemployed and starving. The government prevents aid agents from reaching them, and they prevent the diaspora reaching them. And DFID has been told by so many British academic researchers that MDGs have no meaning for the oppressed. MSGs must take precedence over MDGs, Millennium Security Goals. Tamils, the oppressed people, have no security. They don't want fish, they don't want fishing rod, they want the freedom to fish. Please.
Okay. Is there a question in there, or
a comment for the International Development Chairman?
Myles.
I mean, I think there is an important issue in here, which is that the Millennium Development Goals themselves focus really on primary education and basic health, but they say nothing about the conditions under which those things can be achieved. And it is absolutely right that unless you have standards of good governance, unless you have peace and security, unless you have a lack of oppression, unless you have economic growth, there are a number of enabling things, and I think this is, these are things that the Prime Minister is thinking about when he talks to the Golden Thread. Unless those things are in place, you cannot make progress towards those Millennium Development Goals. So I think it's completely right that we need to think about what sort of things we can say about security in order to make progress towards those goals. And again, I encourage you and everyone to look back at the Millennium Declaration, because I think you'll find a lot of language in there that will give you a great deal of comfort.
I think the point that has to be understood, though, is that in the 21st century, development is a partnership. It's not something that can be imposed from outside. And that, first of all, in terms of bilateral aid, DFID's priority it is mostly poor people in poor countries, and especially those countries which in fact are in post-conflict. So there are a lot of countries in which DFID does not operate bilaterally at all. I mean, in Sri Lanka, for example, DFID did provide emergency support, but does not actually have a bilateral program. But it does support also the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and so forth. So I think people have to understand, which is part of the point of what I was trying to say, is that building the things like human rights and civil rights and pluralism, all those things, cannot be imposed by international aid agencies. They have to be developed from the ground up. But you can work with a range of them. That's Myles' point about appealing to things like the Millennium Declaration, even the Declaration of Human Rights, to say governments should be championing these, but when governments don't, we have to use other avenues to bring them to account.
Thank you. Because I've been told to, I'll say my name. Daisy Cooper, Director of the CAB. Two questions. Thank you both of you for excellent comments. The first is about the nature of aid and the quality of aid. Now, aid can be given in two ways. It can be given as direct aid, but aid can also be given as a loan. And my understanding is that a number of donors have been giving loans to developing countries when the repayment dates for those loans start after 2015. So what are your comments, if any, about the sort of potential impact to a number of developing countries who are going to have to start paying back hefty development aid loans from 2015 onwards? That's the first question. And the second is, has the International Development Select Committee thought about, or has it, tried to actually put a quantitative value on trade barriers in terms of how it might equate as a negative aid flow? I don't imagine for a second that the DAC or the donor community would ever accept, the value of a trade barrier counting against it in terms of its aid flow. But as an academic exercise in trying to make the argument, it would be interesting to know how much money a donor is giving in aid, but actually how much value they are receiving from stopping other countries from trading with them. Thank you.
Hitherto, DFID's bilateral aid has been in the form of grants or technical assistance or project support. One of the things we'll be looking at, indeed, is whether or not loans ought to feature in it. As I said, having met with the French, some of the French development players, a substantial part of what the French do is supply loans. The fact that they go beyond 2015 is not inherently a problem, as long as it's being mutually agreed and it's part of the package. Quite often, governments will say that's what we prefer. In my discussions with the Indian government, they like the fact that the Japanese give them loans rather than grants. They feel that's actually in terms of dealing with it, and they feel that grants can be a bit patronising. So I think it's horses for courses. And on the second one, the issue of trade and aid for trade, I think, is crucial. And indeed, it's not just about tariff barriers, but more about non-tariff barriers. More often than not, sometimes that's not it's just an actual fact that the inability, the lack of skill, the lack of proper infrastructure means that many companies operating in development don't have the capacity to produce a product or service of a quality that is acceptable. In some cases, they cannot meet the standards. Sometimes those standards are set to stop them from meeting them. That is, of course, an applied non-tariff barrier. But in other areas, I quote an example, I suppose, of horticulture. Then there's been a remarkable transformation. In my understanding, there's well over 1 million people in sub-Saharan Africa employed in providing flowers and vegetables to European markets. And actually, the problem they've had is sort of green people in Europe saying, we shouldn't be buying these things coming from sub-Saharan Africa and being flown in. But actually, that prompted one of them to get the Cranfield Institute to do an analysis and prove quite quite objectively that actually the carbon footprint was lower than the same products coming from within the EU. So you should buy flowers and vegetables. So I think it can be done, but we've got to do a lot more of it. And too often, the barriers are too high. And actually, that's what people want more than they want aid.
Can I just make a brief comment on both of the points? The first is that we don't expect aid to continue at high levels forever. Clearly, there will come a point where a lot of these countries, which have become middle-income countries, they will be able to sustain their own economies, and the need, therefore, for aid going in will be less. Now, whether that's going to happen in 10 years' time or 20 years' time is not clear, and aid will concentrate increasingly on sort of fragile states, and there will be other, sort of more direct trading relationships, etc., which on your second point, and just to build on what Malcolm has said, there's an organisation called the Centre for Global Development in Washington, and each year it publishes something called the Commitment to Development Index, and that looks precisely at the sorts of issues that you are talking about. It looks not only at aid quality and quantity, it looks at trade barriers, it looks at distortionary agricultural subsidies, it looks at intellectual property, which can distort goods and services going to developing countries. It looks at all those things, and it kind of marks all the OECD countries against that. Well worth having a look at.
Okay. I wonder if at this point we've got about 10 minutes left. If we could have a show of hands of people who have questions, and we might take 2 or 3 depending on the nature of them. The gentleman with the hat.
Just 2 questions. What race equality systems are in place to protect black and non-white people from the impact of white supremacist racists on the decision-making processes of the House of Commons International Development Select Committee?
Okay.
And that's to do with democracy. Could I have a show of hands, please? Are there any white people here who think that they are not racist?
I think that's an inappropriate question for this conference, but we take the point.
Well, are you racist?
We'll just have the question to the panel, thank you. Mark, could you say your name?
Mark Robinson, UK chair of the Commonwealth Consortium for Education. I first knew Myles when I was a bag carrier in the Chalker for 2 years. We didn't have junior ministers in ODA. We didn't have junior ministers in ODA, so I had to reach the parts of the Commonwealth that Linda Chalker couldn't reach. But Malcolm struck a chord with me today. I'm absolutely delighted if it was created, delighted with the level of resources that it's got. But criticism I often hear is that DFID only does big now. And I just would like the panel's thoughts on whether a mechanism could be created if it can occasionally do things little, because things little occasionally provide the oil from which something much bigger grows. And in the context of the Commonwealth, as I discovered in Mauritius and at Perth, where the Commonwealth really adds value is in the terms of the work that it can do and more it could do in the context of small states.
Victoria, but would you say the name?
Thank you. Victoria Skew, editorial board roundtable. Can I just slightly play the devil's advocate and ask where we have corruption fits into poverty eradication? Because without naming any names, it's well known that a number of countries that require aid do not have very good economic practices and require economic reform and a proper taxation system. So I just wondered where it's somehow the elephant in the room we haven't had a mention of. If we are going to eradicate poverty, we've also perhaps got to eradicate or assist in eradicating corruption.
Thank you. So 3 questions there. The first was on DFID and white supremacist racists.
Specifically in the IDC.
Specifically in the product. Second one, dividends are big. And the third question on the relationship between corruption and poverty eradication.
The democratic legitimacy, what I say is the IDC is now elected by the House of Commons, which is elected by the British people. And that is the accountability. We did actually have a black member of the committee, but unfortunately in the reshuffle he was promoted into government and therefore left the committee. So I didn't make no conclusions from that. The issue about DFID doing those big, I think you picked up a little of that, because I think DFID does a fantastic job, and of course it does a lot of it is government to government, and it's trying to deliver the MDGs on education, and by definition you have to do that on scale. So I think we accept that the majority of what DFID does will be at that scale, not least because it's a big player and other smaller players can do a lot of the smaller things. But I do think that there ought to be a kind of, it's an equivalent of the small business bank or something. There needs to be something like that in DFID, which makes it more accessible. And/or the CDC, which is a kind of investment arm. And I'll just give you one example of a frustration I have. I was approached by somebody near my constituency who was actually a medical professor who has set up a hospital in his home country of Gambia as a putback. He wanted to put something back into his country. He's raising money, but part of his idea is this will be a private hospital which will serve, if you like, the elite, economic and political elite, because at the moment they either leave the country permanently or they leave at certain times because there are no medical facilities and they come to London or they go somewhere else. He says if they've got good facilities there, not only will they stay but will attract other people. But he wants to have outreach so that ordinary people can get free access to the medical facilities that this hospital will provide. And he was looking for £10 million to build the hospital standard. He's got £6 million. And he wanted to know whether DFID could engage with a possible loan or a grant or some support. He didn't even get to first base. DFID said anything under £10 million we can entertain for discussing. And I think that's something. Whether they should have done it or not is not for me to decide. The fact that there was no means to do it, I do think it's an issue. Corruption is, of course, in a sense the elephant in the room, but we actually do talk about it quite openly. And obviously it's really important that anybody's taxpayers' money, whether it's the country receiving or the country delivering, it actually goes to what it's supposed to do and isn't siphoned off. The present government has set up an independent commission on aid impact, which is partly to look into that and identify and improve the systems. But again, it's a partnership. You have to ensure that the governments and the officials that you're dealing with in any given country have some commitment to do it as well. And it is extremely difficult, but a lot of governments recognise in the end that it is essential. And I think democracy is quite important, because once people realise that, if you like, a privileged few are creaming on the country, they get pretty angry about it. And I think that's the best hope in the end, when the people themselves will say, we're just not going to put up with seeing our resources being siphoned up while we're still poor. So I think it's a long process. This is not an excuse, by the way, but when you are very poor, then people try to take on their income by whatever means they can, and therefore often civil servants see their job as a franchise or a gatekeeper's job rather than a service provider, and it's almost understood that that's what it will be. But of course the people who suffer are the people who have to pay the ticket price. In other words, if I want my child to go to school or a decent school or to get into hospital, I've got to pay somebody to get them there. That is corrosive.
Well, just very quickly, I'll just say a very quick comment on all of them. I've spent a great deal of my adult life living in Africa, so you will not be surprised to hear that many of my closest friends are African. And my children are completely colourblind in terms of race. I think that's something to aspire to. In response to Mark's question, I think that maybe as more and more what we thought of as being poorest countries get middle income status, then DFID will need to start to think about ways in which they can reach the poorest groups in those countries without necessarily going through government. So they may need them to to think of ways of channeling those funds, not through central government, and doing some of the smaller things to help the poorest and most vulnerable groups in those countries. And then corruption, I mean, as I said before, I think there's this kind of set of enabling factors which include good governance and peace and security and things. It's also about capacity and strong institutions. One of the other things I do, I'm on board of Wilton Park, which is the Foreign Office sort of conference centre down in Sussex. It was built on the proceeds of corruption. The guy who built it was the treasurer for Queen Elizabeth's army, and he nicked 10% of all the funds that went through in order to build this grand house in Sussex. And the reason is because the systems were not in place to catch people. The British Parliament itself has not been completely exempt from corrupt practice in recent years, as we all know. But basically, there are very strong systems in place in order to prevent this happening. Where you don't have the systems, people will tend to try and get away with things that they can't. So it comes back very much to Malcolm's point about you can't just stop at primary education. You have to get to secondary education, tertiary education, capacity building, putting in place the auditors and the accountants and the people who have the skills to be able to pick up and put an end to that sort of corrupt practice.
We've really only time for one quick question. So the gentleman from the Sierra Leone.
I was fortunate to learn to work in the Office of the President on capacity building and aid harmonization. And by and large, did good work. But I religiously poured through the Gleneagle statements, the Commission report, and at times we were really frustrated, and we kept on pointing to the Accra Agenda and Paris Declaration, and would end up saying, God, it's so much easier to deal with the Chinese. Having said that, I'm just wondering what the Chinese engagement does to you people. And does it force you to sort of alter your engagement with developing countries, A, and B? Where do you see the Chinese engagement going in Africa, if I may divert the question so much?
I'll go first, because Myles was an ambassador, so he can my starting point is, I don't think, if I put it as crudely as this, former colonial powers have got any right to object that China now has some interest in Africa. I mean, it would be hypocritical, and of course they have legitimate interests, but they approach them in their own way. So I think the answer to that is, it really is about, discussions I have with the Chinese is, and I've said this to them, I've said, I don't expect you probably to be the leading champions of democracy and human rights, but I think you should be interested in the rule of law. And that actually helping to strengthen the rule of law is something perhaps we can do together, we can actually agree on. Because in the end, if you're engaging in countries and the law breaks down, everybody loses. And the Chinese on occasion seem to disregard that, but they'll suffer in the end if a country goes up in flames. And indeed, what I did witness, for example, probably completely politically incorrect, so I'll leave the diplomat to clear up the mess. But when I was in Sudan, in South Sudan, some time ago, it was pointed out to me that at the point at which it was becoming clear that South Sudan was about to become an independent country, it was only then, about 3 years ago, that China realised that the oil fields that they were operating were actually in South Sudan. And that South Sudan didn't have a very high opinion of what they were doing, and that consequently, when in the middle of the oil dispute, which we've only just coming to the end of, China offered to mediate, they weren't in a very strong position to be seen as unbiased participants, and it was quite a shock to the Chinese. So they will probably learn the hard way, maybe sometime we did too.
Well, just a last word on that. I mean, I've always found the Chinese actually rather pragmatic and very ready to be flexible. I also think they're generally kind of moving in the right direction. Given the changes that have happened over the last few days in China, there's a kind of willingness to be pragmatic. And I think what's important about their engagement in Africa is that African leaders see the Chinese as being kind of in the same place, but a bit further on. Development in China has taken place a little bit quicker than many African countries, but they are kind of in the same place, rather than, as Malcolm said, colonial masters who are kind of lecturing Africa, do it this way, do it that way, do it our way. And I think that changes the whole dynamic. And so if China could be persuaded to take a slightly different tack on human rights and on sort of access to natural resources, those things, they could be a pretty powerful influence for good. And that would depend on changes in the domestic political situation in China, which I think is moving in a very encouraging direction. Political change in China is catching up with economic change, and I think events over the last few days will help to speed up that process over the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, I'm afraid our session has come to an end. There'll be a quick changeover. There's no break. There'll be a quick changeover of the panel. But I'd like you to join me in thanking you.